The entire situation began when I visited a place I usually wouldn't consider. Having just dropped off one of our more irritating clients at the airport after enduring a morning full of his griping, I was in no rush to return to the office. It was a gloomy Tuesday, and the prospect of spending an afternoon sorting through contracts was unappealing, so I decided to stop at a nondescript bar restaurant roughly a mile from the airport for a relaxed lunch and perhaps a couple of beers before returning to work. There I was, seated in a booth, savoring my beer and pondering over the perennial challenge of finding a decent burger, when my attention shifted to a duo entering the restaurant. I observed them as they chose a booth across from mine and sat closely together. The woman was a curvy blonde in a short skirt, displaying her appealing legs and a snug pink short-sleeved top. Her partner appeared to be an unsuccessful tough guy imposter, clad in jeans and a black leather jacket, but clearly too lean for the look. He struggled to affect the swagger he aimed for. My interest in this couple spiked notably when I realized the woman was Shelley, my sister-in-law, and the man with her was certainly not my brother Dave. Furthermore, they seemed to be more than just casual friends. They ordered beverages and quickly became intimately entangled, openly making out in their booth. As I watched, dumbfounded, the man began to slide his hand up her thigh, disappearing beneath her skirt. Shelley broke off their kiss and leaned her head back against the booth, sighing deeply. The question wasn't if I would intervene, that was inevitable. The real question was whether I could stop myself from physically confronting them right there. I had always disliked Shelley, even when she started dating my brother, and my skepticism only grew when he fell deeply in love with her and hurriedly proposed after only 4 months. Dave was just 23 and, in my eyes, had no clue about the complexities he was stepping into. Shelley to him was everything, but to me she was merely a lively, somewhat superficial and self-centered woman, not nearly as intelligent or engaging as Dave. She was bubbly and charming, qualities my brother cherished, and it seemed they both adored the same person, Shelley. He was always ready to do anything for her, exactly how she preferred. To my astonishment, the first 3 years of their marriage appeared quite joyful. However, the spectacle unfolding before me indicated those happy times were past. The jerk she was with now had moved his other hand to Shelley's waist and was kissing her neck, seductively manipulating her as they embraced. Her eyes were shut, so she didn't notice me approaching until I sat down opposite them and cheerfully remarked, "Well, hello, Shelley." What a pleasant surprise. The reaction was almost humorous. Her eyes flew open, and the boyfriend hastily withdrew his hands and turned to face me, visibly shaken. Her expression transitioned from startled to stunned to utterly shocked. She stared at me, mouth agape, as his expression also registered surprise, then annoyance. Before he could speak, I continued amiably, "How have you been? How's Dave?" Turning to the boyfriend and offering my hand, I added, "My name is Will. I'm Shelley's brother-in-law," her husband's brother. His reaction was one of disbelief. He remained motionless, ignoring my extended hand. Shelley started to regain her composure, somewhat flustered. "Will, what a nice surprise. This is Robbie. He's an old friend." As I asked with a still friendly smile, "You had your hands quite busy there, Robbie." "It seemed you were really engaging her," Shelley gasped, realizing I had seen more than she hoped. Robbie abruptly stood up, mumbled something about needing to leave, and hurried out of the restaurant without looking back at Shelley. "Seems like a nice guy," I remarked casually, watching him depart. Inside, I was seething with anger. My brother adored this woman, and this was her repayment, engaging in a flirtation with some sleazy-looking character sporting greasy hair and a poor imitation of a Dylan mustache. Shelley looked petrified, her face pale as she stammered, "Will, I think you might have misunderstood. We were just..." Her voice trailed off. She had no idea how to complete her thought. I observed her silently for a moment before responding, "You deceitful cheat." I kept my tone subdued, but the anger in my voice was unmistakable. "Dave worships you, provides everything you could possibly want, and yet it's still not enough, is it? You have to go betraying him with shady lowlifes like this one. How long has this been happening? How many others have there been? What do you think Dave will feel when he learns about all this?" "No, Will, please," she pleaded as she clutched my hand desperately. "You can't tell him, please. I'll do anything." I just stared at her. Keep quiet about it? Not inform my own brother that his wife was unfaithful? It was clear Shelley was either incredibly foolish or too shocked to think straight. Dave wasn't just my brother, he was my best friend since childhood. I would do anything for him, and even Shelley must have known that. I withdrew my hand sharply. Why shouldn't I tell him? Doesn't he deserve to know the truth about who he's actually married to? Our eyes were frantic as she tried to think of a way out. Listen, Will, you can't tell him. It would devastate him. Will, if you promise you won't, I'll. I leaned back, smiling slightly. This should be interesting. What are you going to offer? To betray me too? Shelley seemed to come to a decision, her expression firming. Will, if you promise not to tell Dave, I'll reveal everything about. She's doing it too. She's been cheating on you. I burst into laughter. That's rich, Shelley. I was curious what you'd come up with, but this is more ludicrous than I expected. You do have a vivid imagination. But Shelley maintained a serious demeanor. I'm not joking, Will. She's been seeing someone from the gym for at least a few weeks. Her confidence shook me slightly, but I remained skeptical. Anne and I had been a couple since our sophomore year at Kenyon College. We moved in together post-graduation and married a year later. That added up to 7 blissful years of marriage and a decade in total. Anne was loyal, considerate, thoughtful, and the most truthful person I knew, not to mention she adored me. I was as certain of her love as I was of my own for her. Shelley leaned forward, sensing my perplexity. I'm telling you the truth, Will. Anne confided in me last week. She said he was very imposing. As I tried to organize my thoughts, Shelley seemed to recover from her initial panic. She appeared composed and controlled, more like someone disclosing a fact than spinning a desperate tale. Although I found it hard to believe, I couldn't dismiss it outright. Initially, Anne had been hesitant about joining the gym, and for years I was the main user of our home gym. However, recently she had started working out regularly, 3 times a week. There had also been a few peculiar moments at home where she seemed evasive or distracted. I faced Shelley again, who looked expectant of my next step. Concealing her affair from Dave was out of the question, but she didn't need to know that. First and foremost, I needed to ascertain the truth about Anne. All right, Shelley, I began cautiously, perhaps we can negotiate. If you can assist me in uncovering evidence against her, I won't reveal what I saw today. That's if you swear to cut ties with that jerk Robbie and any other man, focusing only on Dave. Her expression brightened with relief. I swear, Will, you have my word. As if her promise held any value to me anymore. What do you need me to do, she asked. I want to learn everything directly from her, in her own words. I'll provide you with a recording device to conceal in your apartment. You should invite her over, offer her some wine, and engage in casual conversation. Get her to disclose everything about the affair. I need to know who this man is, when and how their relationship began, how often she's met him, and why she believes it's acceptable to betray me. As I discussed this with Shelley, I found myself partly convinced by her unbelievable tale of Anne's infidelity, which only fueled my anger. Shelley nodded in agreement. Okay, Will, I can do that. You might need to be gentle with her, share some of your own indiscretions as well so it feels like a genuine personal chat. Continuing with a touch of sarcasm, I asked, is Robbie the only one, or have there been others? She responded quickly, visibly embarrassed. He's the only one. I doubted her sincerity. 20 minutes later, as I drove back to the office, dark thoughts about the potential collapse of Dave's marriage, and possibly my own, filled my mind. One might assume my first call should have been to Dave to inform him of Shelley's actions, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Traditionally, I was the stable older brother, and Dave was the charismatic, sociable younger one. He had numerous girlfriends during his school years, none lasting too long, as he had an effortless charm. A college roommate of his once joked that Dave could charm anyone, a statement that didn't quite make sense but conveyed his allure well. However, everything changed when Dave met Shelley. Rather than the confident man used to attention, he turned into an utterly besotted teenager. Within a short period, Shelley had completely enchanted him. He was determined to marry her, and no one could sway his decision. Dave idolized Shelley, viewing her as flawless. I once lightly criticized her for a thoughtless comment to her mother, and he was so upset he didn't speak to me for days. Thus, I knew I couldn't approach Dave without concrete evidence he wouldn't accept she was unfaithful, unless he heard it from her directly. I clung to a faint hope that Shelley was either mistaken or lying, although each moment made it seem less probable. Upon reaching my office, I wrote down some steps I'd need to take if my fears were confirmed: managing credit cards, selling the house, transferring car titles, etc. I deeply hope to discard that list soon. When I arrived home at dinner, Anne was cheerfully preparing the meal. She welcomed me with a warm hug and kiss, seemingly the same affectionate wife I'd cherished for 7 years. I knew I had to hide my suspicions for a few days and act the unsuspecting husband, which was challenging. I loved her, but beneath the surface, I was seething with anger and pain, unsure of how to feel. During dinner, we conversed pleasantly, but when dessert came and she mentioned her workout at the gym, I couldn't help but inquire a little. "You've been quite dedicated to your workouts lately, sweetheart," I remarked nonchalantly. "Are they handing out free ice cream at the club these days?" She laughed, but I noticed her cheeks redden slightly. "No, darling. I've just been enjoying the great feeling of a strenuous workout, then showering and coming home to my loving husband." She smiled warmly at me, explaining that a few weeks ago, those black trousers I liked were starting to feel a bit snug on her. Now, they fit perfectly. Her beaming smile struck me. She looked so beautiful, and my feelings for her were profound. God help her if she was indeed unfaithful, and God help me as well. Regardless of the official court dates, my marriage effectively ended exactly 1 week later, on another Tuesday. Shelley and I had arranged everything. I provided her with a compact tape recorder to conceal in her living room, and she organized a lunch meeting with Anne at her house on Tuesday afternoon when Anne was off from work and Shelley wasn't employed. That whole afternoon I sat in my office pretending to work, consumed by thoughts of what the women were discussing. At 4:30, Shelley called, informing me that Anne had just left. "Did she talk to you about it?" I asked, still hoping this was all a misunderstanding. Shelley, sounding slightly intoxicated, laughed. "Oh yes, I told her about Robbie, and she told me all about Aaron. He's quite a large guy," she chuckled. I realized I was gripping the phone so tightly that my fingers ached. "All right," I responded, "I'll come over in 20 minutes. When I arrived at Shelley's, she greeted me at the door with the tape recorder in hand. "Remember, Will, you promised," she reminded me. "He won't hear a word from me, and you can't let Anne know that I recorded her. She would be livid, and she might tell Dave." I just nodded, then turned and left. That evening was among the most agonizing of my life. I couldn't listen to the tape until Anne was asleep. Until then, I had to maintain the facade of a loving husband. Anne, still slightly tipsy, told me she had spent the afternoon with Shelley, enjoying quite a bit of wine. She was quite affectionate that evening. As soon as we cleared the dinner dishes, she playfully pulled me towards the bedroom, teasing, "Honey, have you got a little something for me tonight? Could I go through with this?" Did I even want to? It crossed my mind that this might be the last time I'd ever be intimate with Anne. Despite my doubts, I followed her to the bedroom, and we made love. It wasn't as emotional for me. My heart was heavy, and my mind was troubled. Although Anne seemed unaware and was keen and engaging, for me, it was a bittersweet experience, pleasurable, yet incredibly sad. We rested in each other's arms for a while before going again. Soon after, Anne fell asleep, softly snoring next to me. I retreated to the guest room, closed the door behind me, and listened to the tape. The initial part of Shelley's and Anne's conversation was light and cheerful. Shelley kept the wine flowing and, after some time, confessed to her affair, starting the conversation casually before diving into details. She openly admitted that Robbie was just her latest fling, not the best. There had been another man named Ellis, but he had moved out of town. Anne acted surprised but seemed entertained by the story. Listening to Shelley recount the sordid details didn't affect me much. I already knew Shelley's character, and these revelations only solidified what I needed to show Dave, that she indeed had been unfaithful. I waited anxiously for what I anticipated was coming, resisting the impulse to skip ahead on the tape. Eventually, Shelley shifted the conversation towards Anne. "So, sweetie, let's hear your story now," she chuckled. "All you've mentioned is that you met him at the gym, and that he's—" "Ah, well endowed." My body tensed at the sound of Anne's laughter as she responded, "Oh yes, he's incredible, by far the largest I've ever encountered." Both women burst into laughter. Overwhelmed, I stopped the tape and leaned back in my chair, grappling with the realization that my marriage was effectively finished. Did I even want to listen further? Perhaps I could just let my attorney handle it. After a moment's contemplation, I resumed playing the tape, deciding to confront everything now, to fully grasp the situation, deal with my feelings, and start planning my future. How did it start? Shelley inquired. Well, the first thing you should know is that I never intended to cheat on Will. I still can't believe I'm doing it, and it feels awful. He and I are so happy together, and he'd be devastated if he found out. I guess I've just got a bad case of BTF. Anne chuckled, and I heard Shelley ask, BTF. What's that? Anne laughed again and said, I'll explain, just pass me some more wine. You know, I've been going to the health club for a couple of years now. Working out is a drag, but I didn't want to start sagging and lose Will's interest, you know. Anyway, a few months back, this new trainer started there. He's very attractive, not very tall, but with broad shoulders and impressive muscles. His name is Marin, of all names. He's quite the flirt, assisting all the women, setting up their machines, helping them lift weights and so on. One day, I saw him whispering to Patty Mallister, a woman I know from a previous job. She's a redhead, very curvy. I observed them chatting. Then he headed to his office, and shortly after, Patty sneaked in there too. I smiled to myself. It was obvious what was happening, but I didn't think much of it until later. I had finished my workout and was changing in the locker room when Patty walked in looking really pleased with herself. She had that dreamy, satisfied expression and a subtle smile. I greeted her. Hi, Patty, what's up? You seem really happy. She grinned at me and said, Oh yeah, I've got a bad case of BTF. I asked, BTF, and she glanced around to make sure we were alone before whispering, Big tool fever. Then she sat down and spilled everything about her and Marin. How he was an amazing lover with a large endowment, and it drove her wild. They'd been intimate in his office after he'd flirted her into a frenzy. Naturally, that piqued my curiosity, but I still didn't plan on pursuing anything. Patty's divorced, she's free to mingle as she pleases, but I'm a happily married woman. However, over the next few weeks, my curiosity grew as Marin continued to flirt with me. He'd brush against me or touch my shoulder while helping with the equipment. Then, one day I was doing bench presses in an almost empty gym. Marin stood close behind me as if to spot me, and when I looked up, his shorts were right above my head, and there it was, that enormous bulge, clearly visible. I was astounded by how large and solid it appeared, visible even through his shorts. He simply smiled down at me, fully aware of my gaze. I nearly dropped the barbell onto my chest from the shock, but managed to complete my sets. As I replaced the bar on the rack, he gently guided my hand from the bar to his shorts, his anatomy as imposing as it appeared, rock solid to the touch. Moments later, he softly helped me up, glanced around to ensure we were alone, and led me by the hand into his office. My mind wasn't clear. I was somewhat bewildered. He locked the door behind us, seated me in a chair, and without a word, removed his shorts and stood before me. I wasn't thinking clearly at all. We engaged in passionate intimacy. By the end of it, I was utterly spent, overwhelmed and exhausted. Wow, said Shelley, and her tone suggested she truly meant it. That sounds incredible, and I assume you've continued to see him well. After that day, I floated out of his office and into the shower, legs weak, feeling drained. By the time I cleaned up and returned home, the guilt was overwhelming. I couldn't believe I had betrayed Will, and I was terrified he would notice just by looking at me. Surprisingly, he didn't. That evening was routine. He didn't suspect a thing. He even initiated intimacy, but I was fearful he would notice the change in me, so I claimed I was too tired. However, the following night, I compensated, and we were intimate repeatedly until he was spent. For 2 weeks, I avoided the gym, convinced I couldn't trust myself around Marin again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a one-off incident. I was an adult, married to a wonderful man, and I could control myself. So, I resumed my gym visits. The first few times, Marin gave me a casual wink and flirted lightly but kept his distance. I thought I had overcome my lapse in judgment and let down my guard slightly. However, about a week later, he approached me again at the bench press during a quiet moment, took my hand to his anatomy, and soon we found ourselves back in his office. Shelley concluded her narration, her voice dreamy. I can't quite explain it, Shelley. I love being with Will. We always satisfy each other. I had never even considered infidelity before. There's a guy at my office, Alex, very handsome and quite the charmer. He's been successful with other colleagues. But I was never interested. But with Marin, it felt unlike anything I had experienced before. I can't believe I'm confessing this, she said, laughing. It's not even that Marin is special to me in any way, not as a person, not as a partner, but the intimacy is just extraordinary. She laughed again, and Shelley joined in. I listened to them, feeling the anger building inside me. I continued listening to the tape, but there wasn't much more after the second encounter when she fully surrendered to her desires, meeting him 2 to 3 times a week for nearly a month with no intention of stopping. In fact, she mentioned enjoying intimacy with me more recently, perhaps because the thrill of her secret enhanced her excitement. It was apparent that her brief fling had turned into a regular affair, overpowering any guilt she felt about betraying me, the man who loved her devotedly for 7 years, remembering the vow of exclusivity we shared. It took some time to process everything, and it was 2:30 a.m. by the time I finally went to sleep in the guest room. I was resolved to no longer share a bed or even converse with her. I quietly entered the bedroom and prepared my clothes for the next day without waking her. By 6:30 a.m., I was up and out the door, leaving behind only a brief, impersonal note, "You adulterous witch, have an early meeting, sorry forgot to mention it last night." At the office, I made 2 copies of the tape, and by 8:30, I was calling my best friend from college who worked at a downtown law firm. "Hey Eddie, it's Will. I need a big favor. Could you set me up this morning with the toughest, most ruthless divorce attorney in your firm?" After a brief silence, Eddie expressed his shock and sympathy. We talked briefly, and at precisely 11:15, Eddie introduced me to Margaret Adamson, a lead partner at his firm. Eddie had warned me about her formidable reputation, joking that even sharks clear the way when she swims in the ocean, and her firm handshake and stern demeanor confirmed she was all business. I felt relieved she would be representing me, not Anne. I played her a part of the tape, and after hearing just a few moments, Margaret directed her secretary to hold all her calls so we could listen to the rest. Once it was over, we sat in silence until she finally asked, "Okay, what do you want?" I was clear I want a divorce on grounds of adultery, not just irreconcilable differences. I'll be fair about our savings, but I want the house, and she has to revert to her maiden name. She doesn't deserve to carry the name Mrs. Will Harris any longer? Margaret nodded, looking at me sharply, then excused herself to discuss the legal details with Eddie briefly. In less than 5 minutes, I was back in her office, and she was ready to proceed. "The divorce is straightforward, and she won't likely contest your terms. However, you should know the tape is inadmissible since she was unaware of it being recorded. Oh, and your sister-in-law will confirm its authenticity if necessary, she informed me." This is where it got complicated. I explained Shelley's infidelity, her proposition to me, and the contents of the first part of the tape. I hadn't yet told my brother, but knew I had to, as he would be devastated. With a wry smile, I asked Margaret if she would consider handling his divorce too. She exchanged a look with Eddie, then asked to hear Shelley's part of the tape. After playing it, Margaret and Eddie discussed briefly without me. Returning, Margaret commented on the disloyalty of the spouses, quickly apologizing for her remark. "Here's the situation: the tape likely won't be admissible against Anne since she didn't know about it. However, Shelley could be compelled to testify based on what Anne told her. This won't affect the negotiation much once his lawyer hears it. In your brother Dave's case, the tape is admissible since Anne knew she was being recorded. His divorce should be straightforward unless he's unreasonable. Then there's the health club, we can sue them, and Marin. While Marin probably doesn't have much, the club might settle for a significant amount. Perhaps up to $1.5 million to avoid public scandal and potential membership cancellation," she explained. Margaret agreed to start on the divorce papers while Eddie escorted me out, expressing his condolences but assuring me that Margaret would achieve the desired outcome. I tried to smile. "It's okay, Eddie. Looks like we'll have more time to play tennis now." I expressed my gratitude and left. The remainder of the day was consumed with preparations. I scheduled a locksmith to change the locks at our house by 4:30 and arranged to have dinner with Dave to ensure I wasn't home when Anne arrived. I also cancelled her credit cards and opened separate accounts for her finances. Writing a farewell note to the woman I had loved wasn't easy. It required several attempts. Once I was satisfied with the note, I sealed it in an envelope, labeled it with Anne's name, and took it back to the house. The locksmith had finished his work by about 5:15. I sat alone in the kitchen with a beer, then attached the note to the front door, locked it, and left. I knew Anne would return between 6 and 6:30. Curiously, I wondered what she would notice first: her key failing to work, or the note on the door. The note stated, "Our marriage is over. You're now free to seek pleasure with Marin and his impressive attributes. The locks are changed. If you need to collect your personal items, contact my attorney." I included Margaret's contact information, specifying she would coordinate supervised visits to the house when I was absent. I concluded with, "I won't be communicating with you further. You shattered my heart. I loved you deeply, looking forward to our future together. Unfortunately, your commitment didn't match the intensity of ours." When Dave met me for dinner, he immediately sensed something was wrong. After we ordered, I took a deep breath and revealed everything. "Anne has been unfaithful. I'm pursuing a divorce." Dave, visibly shocked, at first couldn't find the words, then quickly apologized for asking if I was sure. Over dinner, sharing my pain with my closest friend proved somewhat therapeutic, especially with his unwavering support. Towards the end of our meal, I disclosed something else. "There's a detail I haven't mentioned yet." Shelley provided the evidence. She recorded Anne's indiscretions. Dave looked at me with sympathy, commenting on his good fortune in having a supportive wife like Shelley, unaware of her duplicity. He started to praise her further, but I couldn't bear it. I interrupted him abruptly. "Dave, wait. Let's not discuss it here. I need you to come back to the house with me." Here's the corrected and paraphrased text. There was a note wedged under the screen door labeled "Will" in flowery script. I placed it on the hall table without reading it and led him into the guest room. "Dave, listen, this is important. You know I cherish you. You're my closest friend and I would never do anything to harm you, right?" He looked at me tiredly. "We didn't usually speak to each other in that manner." "Of course, Will. What is it that you need me to hear the recording Shelley created? Just sit here and listen to it." "I'll be in the next room." I rewound the recording to the start, pushed the recorder towards him, ignoring his astonished expression, and exited the room. I couldn't bear to be there while he listened. Initially, it was silent except for the whisper of voices on the recording. Then a crash. I assumed Dave had hurled an ashtray or something. I heard him pacing. The recording still played. And then finally there was silence. He stormed into the kitchen, glaring at me wildly. "You son of a gun, Dave. You must have." Relished this, knowing the truth about Shelley and concealing it from me, letting me rave about how marvelous she is. "Oh, Dave, this must really please you, you jerk. You've always disliked her, and now you can grin at me and say I told you so for the rest of your life, you scoundrel." I stood and elevated my voice slightly. "Dave, what did I just find out about you? Do you think I'm having a wonderful day?" I stared at him, and gradually his expression softened. I saw his shoulders slump and he loosened his fists. He sat at the table, appearing like an elderly man. "I'm sorry," Will, he finally said. "I know you're suffering just as I am. It's just you obviously were aware of this. Why didn't you tell me, Dave, as gently as I could? You know how you feel about Shelley. You would never have believed me. Remember that argument we had?" I criticized something she had said to Mom. "I learned about Shelley a week ago and I knew I couldn't possibly tell you. You needed to hear it for yourself. I only retrieved the recording from her yesterday. The two of us drained a few beer bottles while I relayed Dave the entire tale. I started with seeing Shelley and Robbie at the diner, then the proposal she extended to me, the production of the recording, and my dialogue with Margaret Adamson. She's managing my divorce, and she'll be glad to represent you as well, if you'd like. Our cases are practically guaranteed wins," she says. We conversed late into the night, and then Dave crashed in my guest room. The phone rang several times, but we ignored it, and eventually I just left it off the hook. Days and then weeks passed, and she continued calling for a while, leaving voicemails of her weeping and pleading to speak to me, but I didn't respond or call back. I simply saw no point in speaking to her. She attempted to locate me at work, but I had our receptionist alert me, and I avoided my office each time she appeared. A few times I noticed a car parked in front of the house when I returned from work, so I just drove past and stayed away for a couple of hours until she left. Margaret Adamson did an exceptional job. The divorce papers were delivered. She battled through all the legal tactics that her lawyer attempted to execute, and a court date was scheduled. In his initial discussions with Margaret, he insisted that no adultery had occurred. Once she sent him a copy of the recording, we ceased hearing that claim. Instead, he emphasized that the recording was inadmissible. Margaret simply ignored that argument as the court date drew near. The lawyer for her finally contacted Margaret to request a settlement meeting. The day after hearing the recording, Dave moved out of his apartment with her and into my guest room. He drove over and watched the place until she left, then called me. The two of us packed up everything he wanted and left there in less than 2 hours. Here's the corrected and paraphrased version of the text. I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear anything she says. I just want to escape from her, he told me, his eyes beginning to water. I looked away, wondering whether it was good or bad that I could relate to his feelings. He left me a few furious, swearing messages at home, a stark contrast to Anne's regretful ones. After a day or two, I started erasing the messages, deleting any from Anne or Dave as soon as I recognized their voices. Dave never replied to the letters I sent to his workplace. Margaret was managing his divorce as well, and he and I simply sat back and let her take control. To my surprise, the lawsuits against Marin and the health club were settled quickly. The case against Marin went nowhere. He vanished one day without leaving any contact details. The health club, eager to avoid bad press, as Margaret had anticipated, agreed to a $1.1 million settlement. I signed a non-disclosure agreement and left with the largest check I'd ever held, all within less than 10 weeks. My brother was a solid support, and I suppose I was for him too. We lived like two bachelors, frequently dining out, occasionally catching a baseball game, or just relaxing and chatting over some beers. We discussed Shelley and our lives with them and how many wonderful women there were out there waiting for us. It was hard to believe that last part, yet we really managed to support each other. I could tell as clearly as Dave could that there was nothing wrong with Dave that caused Anne's actions. She was just selfish. Likewise, Dave reassured me that my partner's infidelity wasn't a reflection on me, but rather a sign of her messed up state. Neither of us fully believed the other, but it still helped to hear it. Dave got his divorce finalized first. He made it clear he wouldn't speak to his ex under any circumstances, so Margaret handled everything. She informed him that his ex had initially demanded more money, but with the recording she had no grounds to stand on. I accompanied him to the office the day he had to sign the divorce papers. His ex had already signed them. He gave a grim smile, shook Margaret's hand in thanks, then headed to the restroom. I heard him sobbing when I went to check on him. 3 weeks later, it was my turn. We met on a Tuesday, me and the two lawyers, and then our lawyer. We had agreed to a settlement, but she insisted on 2 conditions: that I remove adultery as the reason for the divorce, and that I meet with her privately before signing. I told Margaret I was willing to meet with her, but not to omit adultery. Eventually, we agreed that I'd give her a chance to convince me. If she could, we'd change it to irreconcilable differences, that common fallback. In a strange way, I was looking forward to hearing what she had to say. Maybe I'm a masochist, but I had loved her for 10 years and couldn't imagine just walking away without one last discussion. When I arrived, she was in the conference room wearing a blue dress I had always admired. Her hair was shorter and looked great. She was pale, but still the same beautiful woman I had loved for so long. "Okay, it's your meeting," I said neutrally. My heart was racing, but I tried to appear calm. "Just 2 things, please don't tell me you love me, and don't claim it was just physical," I requested. She blushed, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "Will, I'm so sorry, but how can I not say those things? I messed up, I was selfish and careless, and I hurt you. But it was just physical, nothing more than a foolish impulse I gave into. You can't imagine how much I've regretted it, how many times I wished I had never done it." "Yes, well, but you did do it, didn't you?" I had no intention of making this easy for her. Just being in the same room with her, knowing that we were about to part for good, and why, broke my heart all over again. I stared out the window, unwilling to let her see my distressed face. Behind me, I could hear her softly crying. "Baby, it meant nothing. You know it was the dumbest, most hurtful thing I could ever have done to you. I know that, but to me it meant nothing." "It has nothing to do with how much I care about you." I let her continue talking, listening to her pleading tone, the sweet voice I had once adored, but not absorbing a single word that I couldn't have anticipated. She had nothing new to say to me, and nothing she said made any real impact. After a bit, I turned around, returned to the table, and sat directly across from her. "Just so you know, I still care about you a lot, but it's over between us," I stated clearly. She began to weep again. "You took away the most precious thing we shared, aside from our love, the trust between us. How could I be intimate with you again, wondering if it was me you were thinking of, or Marin and his bazaar? Possessions? How would I know if you were truly with me or longing for him? And how could I live with you, always wondering where you were every time you were 10 minutes late, or what you were doing on your lunch break, or whether you'd found someone else to entertain you?" I waited. but she had no response. Finally, between her sobs, she pleaded, "Please, darling, please. Couldn't you give me one more chance? I'll give you a few minutes to think about this. What if I had met some woman with incredible looks and had a fling with her just for the thrill? Someone I neither liked nor respected, just a physically attractive woman who provided a level of pleasure I never got from you, and then you found out. Could you stay with me? Could you move past the pain, the profound sense of betrayal? Could you dismiss the doubts about your own allure, the fears that you weren't the one I truly desired?" She looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. "Well, I don't need to think about it. I've been thinking about it for weeks now. Could I forgive you? Could I take you back if it were the other way around? And the answer is no. I just couldn't cope with those feelings. I know that, so I'm asking you to be something I couldn't be, to be braver, stronger, and to give me a chance to prove how regretful I am and how deeply I care about you." There was silence for a minute, 2 minutes, as we stared at each other, both contemplating everything we had meant to each other and how we had reached this point. I stood up slowly, despising myself and resenting her for her infidelity and now for making it my burden to bear. I don't know whether I can't do it or won't do it, but I'm not that braver, stronger person you hope for. Goodbye. I paused by the open door for a moment, looking back, giving her the opportunity for the last word. She had her head down, weeping. She said nothing more. Margaret was waiting for me down the corridor, a surprisingly empathetic expression on her usually stern face. "Let her have irreconcilable differences," I muttered. It didn't make a bit of difference to me. Dave and I sat at my kitchen table. We'd had a few drinks, but weren't intoxicated. "Listen," I began. "I've made some plans." He nodded. And I continued. "After the lawyer fees, I still have nearly $800,000 from that settlement. I've invested all but $50,000 of it in some secure investments, so there'll be a substantial nest egg for when we're old and fragile. But the last $50,000 has been allocated to the Willing Dave Harris Recovery Fund, and we're going to start using some of it. I've booked us a 4-week stay at a 2-bedroom condo in Cancun, starting in 2 weeks. Go tell your office you're taking some time off. We're going to be a pair of fun-loving bachelors, 2 happy divorcees, if you catch my drift." He simply raised an eyebrow, and I chuckled. "No, gay as in joyful. We've spent enough time sulking and telling each other how unfairly we've been treated. Cancun turned out to be a blast, or at least as much fun as it could be for 2 men recovering from heartbreak. We soaked up plenty of sunshine, played lots of tennis, swam a great deal, and drank generously, though we made sure to keep each other from spiraling. With each passing day, we became a bit tanner, a bit healthier, and moved a bit further from the nightmare we had just endured. And let me tell you, thank God for my charismatic and charming brother. Despite the hit to his self-esteem that Shelley had inflicted, he found his old charm again, and we enjoyed plenty of female company. His favorite trick, successful about 75% of the time, was to approach 2 appealing women sitting together. He would pull me over to their table, flash a charming smile, and say, "Excuse me, ladies, I'm sure you wouldn't be comfortable letting a stranger buy you a drink, so let me introduce my brother, Will Harris." Then it was my turn, the shy one, to say, "Delighted to meet you both. This is my brother, Dave Harris." Then he'd step back and add, "Glad that's settled. Now may we buy you a drink?" By this point, the women were usually at least smiling, if not laughing, and we'd often end up enjoying their company for the evening. Sometimes the company lasted until breakfast. After all, unattached women in Cancun were just as eager for fun as we were. I shared my bed with about 6 different women during those 4 weeks, and I suspect Dave's number was slightly higher. Mostly, it was just fun, laughter, and light-hearted pleasure. The first couple of times I was intimate with a woman, I was hesitant, my thoughts distracted by Marin and his attributes, even though both he and Anne were thousands of miles away. It was tough not to compare with what I knew he had done to her. But the women didn't seem to notice, and being with someone new became easier each time. One-night stands might not be for everyone or suitable for every phase of life, but they seemed to be exactly what Dave and I needed. Only one of the women was different. Shannon, a tall Irish redhead, a year younger than me. We did all the usual things, had some drinks, shared a lot of laughs, went out for dinner, danced, and then headed back to my place. She was sexy and as eager to be with me as I was with her. We had a great time, but things changed around 3 a.m. For some reason, I woke up and just lay in bed, Shannon softly breathing beside me, but my mind filled with thoughts of everything I had lost. I started crying very quietly, and before I knew it, Shannon was kneeling beside me, holding me in her arms, telling me to let it out, that it was. Okay. I was embarrassed but couldn't stop. She continued to comfort me, and eventually, in response to her encouragement, I shared my entire story with her. By the time I was done, the sun was rising. We moved to the kitchen, and I prepared breakfast for us while she shared her own story, also a divorcee, no infidelity, just a husband who became increasingly distant and focused on his career until there was no marriage left. She had been on her own for nearly 2 years. After we ate, we found our way back to the bedroom without a word and made love again. The night before had been about fun, excitement, and camaraderie, just physical. But this time, we gazed into each other's eyes, whispered tenderly, and discovered a very different level of intimacy. My fleeting encounter with Shannon extended into 4 delightful nights. By the time she departed in the afternoon, my brother Dave expressed some concern for me. "Come on, bro, time to meet some new ladies," he encouraged. "That one was special," I murmured. "I believe you," he responded. "I liked her too, but she's returned home now, Will, and we have 10 more days to enjoy here. I'm not ready to stop enjoying myself yet." He then pulled me to the tennis courts, followed by the pool, and by that evening we were conversing with 2 office workers from San Francisco on their initial journey abroad. That night, they returned to their own hotel room, but the following afternoon, Barbara accompanied me to my room for her inaugural experience of intimacy on foreign land. Dave and I dined at a favored steakhouse. It had been 8 months since our trip to Cancun. Dave had recently settled into a fantastic apartment he adored, yet we still spent ample time together. Just after we ordered, Dave leaned in and whispered, "Don't turn around, okay?" Across the room, 2 couples had just taken their seats, one of whom was an acquaintance. I appreciated the caution. My heart raced, and I preferred not to show my reaction. After a few moments, I nonchalantly glanced across the dance floor. She had already noticed us and was gazing steadily at me. I offered her a polite, non-committal smile, and she reciprocated. Then I forced myself to turn back and continue chatting with my brother. "Is this the first time you've seen her since the divorce?" he inquired. I nodded. I didn't anticipate such a strong reaction, but perhaps the surprise is partly to blame. "Just do me a favor," I requested. "Let us enjoy our meal. Don't tell me anything about what she's doing over there or how she looks." "I don't want to know, that's fine," he replied, and launched into an amusing tale about a colleague who had been flirting with him for the past few weeks. He wasn't particularly interested in her, but was amused by the interaction. As we lingered over our coffees, watching the dancing couples, I felt a hand on my shoulder and that familiar voice asked, "How are you?" I stood up and looked into her eyes, her face beaming. "Hello again," I managed, again taken aback. "How about a dance for old time's sake?" she suggested. "Of course I'd be delighted," I responded. I felt how comfortable she was in my arms, how stunning she appeared, and recalled the joyful times we shared. Initially, we conversed lightly about our jobs and the unusual cold for this season. Then, we fell silent. I was absorbed in the sensations of holding her once more and the memories of our dances. As the dance neared its end, she pulled back slightly to look into my eyes. "How are you, really?" she pressed. I wanted to be truthful, though I certainly owed her nothing. "I'm all right, pretty good, I suppose. Some days are harder than others. Seeing you tonight, dancing with you, it's incredibly moving. I didn't realize it would affect me so much," I confessed. She gazed at me earnestly. "Well, I'm not so all right. I miss you every day. You can't imagine what it's like to be in your arms again," she admitted. I didn't know what to say, so I remained silent. The final chords of the music played, but she wasn't ready to release me. "Have you ever wondered if you made the right decision, Will? Honestly, I still think about you and me all the time, but I seldom get past wondering why you made the wrong choice," she said. "When I dropped Dave off, he checked on me. Are you sure you're okay, Will?" I sighed. Yeah, it was a shock, but it was inevitable sooner or later. This isn't such a big town. "Are we still on for tennis after work tomorrow?" Dave confirmed, and I headed home. I entered the dark bedroom quietly and undressed. As I slipped into bed, Shannon rolled towards me. "How was the evening with Dave?" "It was nice. Strange, actually." "Maybe it was for the best that you were tired tonight because I ran into an old friend at the restaurant. It's probably just as well you didn't come. You might have ended up causing a scene," I speculated. Do me a favor, okay, Shannon? Could you just hold me for a few minutes, I requested. Her loving smile glowed in the darkness. I'll do better than that, baby. Come here and let me make everything all right, she offered, as I breathed in her sweet scent and felt her tender kisses along my neck.